I'm Katrina Raynon-Woodward, and I have the great privilege of being Program Director at Melbourne Business School's Executive Education. I warmly welcome you all, staff, students, alumni and guests, to the first of our 5-part Masterclass series on intelligence for business. This session is on disinformation and malign influence. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional owners of the land on which I am today, and pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present and emerging. I also pay my respects to their communities who have shared and practiced their teaching over thousands of years. Melbourne Business School's vision is unleashing leaders for a sustainable future, and we do this by creating and sharing knowledge to help understand, guide and shape the future of business, government and for the for-purpose sector. And so events like today's Masterclass offer ongoing learning and access to contemporary thinking in business and leadership, and it's one of the many ways of supporting our school's commitment to lifelong learning. I'm utterly fascinated by how we as a society are happy to shape our beliefs and frame our decisions based on best evidence, yet we're less prone to examine the evidence itself, perhaps assuming that facts are facts. Critically examining the information upon which we base our beliefs is an essential skill for the 21st century. To guide us in this really important conversation, it's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. Morgan Saletta. Morgan is the director of the Hunt Laboratory for Intelligence Research at the University of Melbourne. Morgan's current research and teaching focuses on disinformation and building resilience to malign information operations, as well as collective intelligence and crowdsourcing intelligence, cognitive security, and the use of narrative reasoning in solving complex problems, including intelligence problems. Morgan has a wide range of interests in science and technology studies and is a facilitator on a range of topics, including disinformation. We're very excited to be hearing from Morgan today. And you know the routine. If you have questions throughout the session, please drop them in the Q&A box. I'll weave them into the class where I can, and in any event, we'll ensure that we leave time at the end of the session to cover these. So with no further ado, Morgan, over to you. Welcome.
Great. Thank you very much, Katrina, for that. I'm delighted to be here as well. Before beginning, I'll just give a quick session overview. As Katrina said, I'm Morgan. I'm the director of the Hunt Lab. I deliver training on disinformation and misinformation to the national intelligence community here in Australia. I work with the national intelligence community in the Philippines as well. I'm delighted to give a talk on the subject today. So we'll start off with some examples and some historical perspective, some key definitions, introduction to disinformation, misinformation, and malign influence, something I call DMMI for short. We'll look at some case examples and some key takeaways, and we'll talk briefly about defending against disinformation, misinformation, and malign influence. So I think actually that disinformation and misinformation probably need no introduction. Most of us have been exposed in some way to something related to this, whether it's fake news, whether we've seen scams, financial scams, or we know somebody who's been taken in. We've seen disinformation on the global political scale and in geopolitics. And it's something that's affecting all of us in what really is a volatile, uncertain, complex, and dynamic world. So one of the reasons that we are looking at disinformation and malign influence in the business world, so my background is largely in national security, and we're taking some of the lessons that we've been looking at in this space and trying to offer them to the business community. And some of the reasons for that is that DMMI, disinformation and malign influence, can erode trust in markets, institutions, and industries. It can disrupt or derail operations and projects, deals. Obviously, it can cause financial loss, can erode competitive advantage, lead to reputational and brand damage. It can also lead to misinformed strategic policy or economic decisions, and it can contribute to insider threats. So some quick examples of some costs that have resulted from disinformation and malign influence over the last 10 to 15 years. In 2013, the Associated Press in the US, their Twitter feed was hacked. And there was a tweet went out that there had been explosions in the White House. This briefly erased 136.5 billion in market value. A construction firm, a large construction firm in France, Vinci SA, had false information published on Bloomberg. This was the result of essentially counterfeit press releases, which led to an 18% share price drop. That was essentially fake news claiming that there had been financial irregularities at the company. Avon Products in 2015, there was a fraudulent SEC document that led to a 20% stock surge. So this is, people perhaps trying to manipulate stock market prices. Bitcoin ETF hoax. Again, the SEC's site was hacked. Their social media account was hacked, and a claim was made that the Bitcoin trading had been, in this case, had been approved, and there was a spike in Bitcoin price. And quite recently, we saw the use of a deepfake scam, which was a video call that convinced a worker he was authorized by people known to him to transfer some $25 million to scammers. These were people using, fake facial, paste on face kind of deepfake within a video, a call to convince him to do that. So clearly it can lead to financial losses, but there are many other impacts as well. And we'll talk about some of those briefly in today's talk. Before I start, though, I do really want to reiterate or emphasize, rather, that some of the problems that we're seeing today are not new. They can feel new, certainly with regard to social media and the rapidly evolving information environments that we're seeing. But actually, much of what we're seeing today was predicted by people looking at the ways that mass communication were altering society back in the 60s. One of those people was the Canadian scholar Marshall McLuhan, who coined the term the global village. He says the new electronic interdependence recreates the world in the image of a global village. Now, Marshall McLuhan was talking about radio and television, electronic communications at the time. And while the phrase global village was sometimes used in a sort of a utopian sense by early tech entrepreneurs, Marshall McLuhan certainly saw that this was not necessarily a utopian vision. He thought that the global village would also lead to increased tribalization and increased frictions as people could see what was happening around the world and react to them as if it were next door. So this is something that we're all familiar with, but I think it's just important to reiterate that what we're actually seeing, even if it can feel revolutionary, is in fact quite evolutionary, right? We're seeing some evolutionary changes of things. And the other thing that Marshall McLuhan saw, and I think this is actually really important, was that electronic media form environments, right? These are environments that surround us, and these environments can change us and manipulate us in ways that we don't notice because we're surrounded by the environment, so we don't actually see it. And this is something, again, he was talking about radio and television, but this is very much true. Now we talk about the information environment, and it just rolls off the tongue. But this is something that this was an idea that he essentially came up with, and the ways that we can be manipulated without realizing we're being manipulated within these environments is really important to understand. Now, the other thing, again, is, as I said, I think a historical perspective is actually really important here. And I'm going to start with an example that's not specifically a business example. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One of them is because we know a lot about this example, but it also allows us to take a deep historical perspective and actually see the way that disinformation that was begun many, many years ago has had an impact really quite recently. And this is something that I talk about. I talk about the sort of long half-life of disinformation. The fact that we can sort of see zombie disinformation as well. It gets resurrected in new forms over time. And some of the modern case examples that we'll be talking about, we just don't have that kind of data long-term to be able to see how this can happen. So this example can show us some of the ways that disinformation can evolve and change over time and have long-term influences. So in this case, this is AIDS disinformation. This was actually a Soviet disinformation campaign that was launched in the 1980s. Known as Operation Denver, although in the popular press it's now known as Operation Infection. There's a really good, actually, documentary that's free to see that was put out by the New York Times on this if you're interested in it. And I call this a tale of two diseases because it's going to take us right up to COVID-19, with apologies to Dickens, of course. And this disinformation campaign was essentially asserting that AIDS was the result of bioweapons research that was conducted by the United States government in the 1980s. And again, this was put out by the Soviets. In this example, there's a couple things to understand, right? So the first one is the public health and epidemiological background. So I grew up in San Francisco at the time. I saw the early effects of the AIDS epidemic. And the fear that existed before people knew how it was transmitted, before the virus had been identified, and of course that's an that's an environment that's ripe for disinformation, right? When there's fear, there are vulnerable populations, and this is and there's a gap of information, right? People don't know something, so it gets filled with dis or misinformation. Now, the other context is a geopolitical context, and this is the geopolitical context was the Soviet use of chemical weapons in Afghanistan and Southeast Asia, right after the invasion of Afghanistan in 1980. These are quite well researched. There were very quite plausible accusations of the use of chemical weapons by the Soviets. And essentially, in order to distract against these accusations that had been raised internationally, the Soviets began experimenting with the disinformation campaign. And they put out quite a few stories, including ones about killer mosquitoes that had been bred by the CIA to spread encephalitis in Pakistan. But they hit on a winner with this AIDS disinformation. And the AIDS disinformation started off, it was released in an English language newspaper in India. Today, we would use a proxy news site, right? We have a fake website. This was a KGB-funded newspaper in India. And it put out this story in the first person from a kind of a whistleblower, right? Telling the story about how AIDS had basically been started as bioweapons research at Fort Detrick, Maryland. It's important to remember that name, Fort Detrick in Maryland, because we'll see it get resurrected. Now, attribution is very difficult, as most people, anyone who works in cybersecurity would know, and with disinformation, when it's deliberate spread of false information, we can see that attribution is quite difficult. In this case, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, researchers were given access to archives in a number of different countries. And so we have some smoking gun telegrams, and in fact, the Soviets actually admitted to the campaign as well. So now, one interesting thing that happened with this was that this story started off in a very small newspaper in India, but by 1987, the story had achieved what today we would call virality, and it achieved a breakout moment again in I believe 1987. When Dan Rather on CBS News, was a hugely influential and respected American journalist at the time, actually talked about the story. Now, he didn't endorse the story, but he talked about it in the narrative they're spreading, talked about in the mainstream press and or mainstream discourse. It's something that I achieve the virus, or this example to illustrate a number of key things. And one of these is that disinformation can have a very long half-life. So back in the day, Ronald Reagan started a government group called the Group to this Soviet disinformation. They were very active in sort of spreading counter narratives and spreading the light of day, actually just exposing people to the fact that there was this disinformation out there. Gorbachev eventually basically shut the program down. And then, there was the whole fall of the Berlin Wall, et cetera, later. However, this AIDS disinformation, which was started as Soviet disinformation, has continued to bubble away in various conspiracy theories around the world, and particularly within the African American community, who have good reason to doubt and be distrustful of the government for a number of reasons. This is not one of them. But we can see here in Kanye West, we see that his lyrics of the song are reflecting this idea that the AIDS was the result of US government research. And there were many polls that expressed that. So coming up to COVID-19. So in the early days of COVID-19, we start to see a kind of a mirror campaign with this. In January 2020, we start to see some purported experts in Russia, not the Soviet Union anymore. I have to sometimes, I'm an old Cold War person, so I sometimes still use that term, start to make assertions that COVID-19 might have been the result of US bioweapons research. In February 2020, we start to see numerous state-funded and proxy sources spreading this message. And by March and April of 2020, it had become a well and truly established conspiracy theory on social media. Interestingly, though, the country that was probably most responsible for taking this and running was China, and the Communist Party proxies began actively spreading this. So in cartoons, in news stories, and in this case, petitions to essentially get the World Health Organization to look at the supposed origins of COVID-19 at Fort Detrick, right? So it's like the DNA of the original Soviet disinformation is right here. You can see that it's actually just been recycled and reused. And that's because it resonates with existing conspiracy theories, right? And it's been bubbling away for a long time, and it gets reborn in a sort of a new setting. So this is something that we have to be very careful about. We might think that disinformation might be very short-lived, or misinformation might be short-lived, but we can't always know that, right? It can actually bubble away and then be reborn in new ways. So I want to look at some key definitions now. I wanted to start off with kind of an interesting case study to introduce you to some of the ideas. And then I want to focus in on just quickly go over some definitions. So when we talk about disinformation, we're talking about false or misleading information that's spread deliberately. The person knows it's false, or the group knows it's false. And motives can include causing harm, financial profit and exploitation, political exploitation, et cetera. Misinformation is false or misleading information that's spread by somebody that doesn't know that what they're talking about is false or spreading is false. There's another term that's used less often, but it's important, is malinformation. And this is information that's true or partially true, but it's spread with deliberate intent to cause harm to a person, an organization, or a country. So in this case, for example, we can talk about doxing, right, or hack and release operations, right, like the hack and release operation that harmed Hillary Clinton's campaign. Malign influence is coordinated efforts to manipulate perceptions or behaviors in ways that undermine autonomy, security, or best interests of the targeted individual, group, or organization. Fake news is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but really, when we're being rigorous about what we talk about when we talk fake news, we're talking about stuff that's meant to mimic news, right? So that might be a cloned website or articles made to look like they're coming from a reputable news source. Conspiracy theories, of course, we're all familiar with these. And cognitive hacking, right? A lot of folks are using this term now, and And this is deliberate manipulation of people's perceptions, beliefs, emotions, or decision-making processes through deceptive tactics, through disinformation, misinformation, and ultimately causing the person or the group to act or refrain from acting in ways that serve the attacker's interest.
Morgan,
Oh,
may I ask a question?
yes, and I think I went through, sorry, I just have to go back because I think I went through 2 slides there. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Just you mentioned at the start about deep fakes. So fake news is something that I think we kind of get our head around. We hear about it a lot. And then you talked about deep fakes, and I think that's sort of associated with AI or something, right? Can you just add that to the definitions?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, coming up with a definition off the top of my head, right? I mean, most of us probably have a vague sense of what a deepfake is. Deepfake is using generally using sophisticated AI techniques to manipulate audio, visual images in ways that are so convincing that people think they're real. So, taking a politician's face. And mapping it onto an actor's face, for example, to make it look like the politician said or did a particular thing, right? So that's an example of that. We've seen it with audio as well, with just plain audio, visual, deeply manipulated images, right, that look real, but aren't, right? So through synthetic means. So the scale of the problem, not program, it's a global phenomenon. One of the things that we're seeing from active research in this area right now is that everybody can fall for it. It's really easy to think that because we're educated or that we're good critical thinkers, we can't fall for disinformation. It's absolutely not true. We can, and most people have done at some point, fallen for something that's not true. This can impact large and small organizations. The target are human beings, but largely what we're seeing today, not always, it's not always cyber-enabled, but often what we're talking about is cyber-enabled. And that means that cognitive security and cybersecurity are connected. And this is something that many organizations tend to think about cybersecurity and human security in sort of different ways. But when it comes to disinformation, misinformation, and malign influence, these really need to be brought together in a sort of holistic approach to try to protect people's cognitive security against cyber-enabled malign influence. And it obviously requires an enormous amount of vigilance and multifaceted responses. And we'll talk about some of the responses in today's lecture, but briefly, because it's today's talk, because it's quite a short talk. Some of the motivations that we see behind disinformation and malign influence is financial gain or competitive sabotage, right? The sabotage of competitors. We see it used to engage in industrial or corporate espionage. Its deception and disinformation are used in extortion and ransom. And it can also be used for with what we would call economic warfare or for geopolitical goals, often sponsored by state actors. We'll see some examples. Some of the key players. Rivals and competitors in the business world can spread disinformation or misinformation about their rivals or competitors. Organized crime groups are a major player. State-sponsored actors are also a player here. Another big problem is that there are a lot of disinformation for hire groups or so-called troll farms or digital black ops PR firms that essentially enable this. Influencers and financial influencers or finfluencers. We see activist groups involved in this. And there are, of course, ideological driven groups as well that may spread disinformation or try to engage in malign influence of some form for ideological reasons or political reasons. And then, of course, there are also insiders. This can be disgruntled employees or former insiders, disgruntled ex-employees may also engage in spreading disinformation. Some of the key effects that we see or impacts of disinformation and malign influence. We see market and stock price impact, right? So some of the key tactics that we see with this are so-called pump and dump or short and distort schemes. We see fake analyst reports, rumor mongering and amplification on various social media platforms. We see reputational damage is a major impact. Key tactics can be various smear campaigns, fake exposés, negative SEO attacks, sort of on the cyber-enabled side, and hack and release operations. Of course, these aren't all the tactics that are used. There's just some examples. Operational disruption, right, of projects. Key tactics may be hacking, data manipulation, timed leaks, astroturfing of community opposition. We'll see some examples of this, including environmental concerns. The manipulation of public opinion and policy manipulation that can change the environment in which a business or industry operates. And we also see geopolitical and economic advantage as one. And this is often advanced by state-sponsored or as well as advanced non-state actors targeting key sectors or multinational corporations, supply chains, and using lots of different tactics in order to do this. Some of the key enablers that are making what we see possible, right? Of course, we've spoken a little bit about the new technologies and the social, and with the new technologies go the social media business models that make some of this spread of dis and misinformation possible. Speed of communications, algorithms are a problem, and amplification, right, can produce what we could call digital wildfires, right, or viral moments where disinformation can spread very, very rapidly. And then, of course, there's the black market for disinformation and malign influence. I mentioned black ops PR firms, troll farms for hire. This is a major problem. It's very, very easy to purchase social media manipulation online. You don't have to go to the dark web even to do it. The NATO Center of Excellence on Strategic Communications has some really excellent reports. They talk about, they've done some research on the black market for social media manipulation. Lots of it comes out of Russia, but lots of other countries as well, where people are often just in need of money, but quite willing to use their knowledge in marketing, et cetera, to engage in these practices.
Morgan, just before we go through the sector-specific areas,
sure,
a couple of questions that might be interesting to weave in at this point. One of our listeners or one of our participants is saying, you mentioned earlier groups repurpose or recycle existing narratives, for example, conspiracy theories. And the question is it harder to inject new narratives into the information environment than exploiting existing narratives? Is it how do you change the kind of narrative once it's begun and it's become this existing narrative?
So it's kind of two questions in there. I don't know that it's more difficult. I think we see the emergence of new narratives all the time. But if somebody can leverage an existing narrative, right, that is already bubbling away in various dark corners, if you will, of the internet, it can make it easier to spread, right? I think. Now, the second question was, or a related question was, sorry, I've forgotten it now.
No, it's about the injection of new narratives, I think.
Oh, yeah, I've got it now. Sorry. Now, one of the problems, a lot of research shows that disinformation and misinformation can be sticky, right? I talked about the long half-life. And this is a problem that even when it's been debunked, so to speak, or it's been shown to be false, people can still remember it as being true. And so some of the most recent research has been done at Cambridge University by people like Sander van der Linden, suggest that you need to debunk this stuff really often. With the AIDS disinformation, I think the issue was it was being debunked at the time when it was spread. And then people just forgot about it. It just became a conspiracy theory that no one really worried about, right? Until all of a sudden it's COVID-19 days again, and it's getting recycled and transformed. And it's like, oh my gosh, we've got to sort of debunk this, right? So there's this idea that you have to do it often and continually if you're seeing it, right? Otherwise, it just keeps spreading and it sticks, right? So.
And sorry, the other question, Morgan, and it may be relevant to answer now, but someone's asking about can this whole information environment affect you personally and professionally as an individual? The question is, can DMMI affect an individual, and how do you find out and act accordingly? Is that a thing? Can it affect?
Yeah, so absolutely. There are lots of ways that DMMI affects individuals. Now, I've focused on organizations in today's talk. Look, one of the major ways that disinformation can impact individuals that we're seeing and having large costs on people, right, are financial scams. And unfortunately, romance scams, right? Romance and sex scams, right, is a huge one. It hits people of all gender and all ages. And actually, these types of things can be used to try to extort or exploit people, right? And that's one of those areas where it can become something that it impacts an individual. They've been tricked out of their money. They've been tricked into an embarrassing situation or revealing information about themselves. Or they can be tricked into revealing information about an organization as well, right? So there's ways that this kind of goes on. I think many of us know people that have fallen for scams. Some of us may even have fallen for scams ourselves, right? They're increasingly sophisticated. And again, things like deep fakes are making this possible. For example, with romance scams, people start off on a dating website and then they get involved in a conversation. They go off platform, they get involved in conversations with people where people are using face swapping techniques to hide who they are. And they're not actually even talking to the real person, but they think they are. This is, and I think that kind of thing is just going to get worse. I didn't go into the romance scams or the sex scams in detail in today's talk, but there's a lot of information out there, and it's really not pleasant. Unfortunately. So I just want to I'm going to talk about a couple sectors now and just give some brief, won't call these case studies because they're more like case examples. Because these are things that are emerging as we go. That we don't have as deep a historical understanding of what's happening as we do with, for example, the AIDS disinformation. So in the mining sector, and this is actually something that we're seeing not just in the mining sector, but across what we might call critical infrastructure and critical supply chains. This is an example. This was a disinformation operation that was run by Chinese Communist Party proxies. This was revealed by Mandiant as well as some other investigation firms. And this was targeting Lynas Rare Earths operations. Lynas is an Australian company. It's targeting their operations in Malaysia, but also in Texas. And essentially, this was hijacking using fake accounts, or what we call sock puppet accounts, to hijack what might be legitimate environmental concerns, right? And this is a delicate area, right? Because there are all kinds of reasons local people might have legitimate environmental concerns about an industry or about mining, et cetera. But in this case, these are accounts, these are not legitimate citizens of the country, right? These are essentially operatives working to try to create or amplify concerns and protests about a mining operation in order to disrupt it. And this is because there's geopolitical competition going on right now. This is the geopolitical background. We saw the geopolitical background with the AIDS example. Today, we've got a lot of great power competition going on, where I think we're all aware of this. And we're seeing state actors engaged in this similar operation, although we don't have evidence of attribution, accusations of similar operation going on in Serbia, likely run by Russia, and that was targeting Rio Tinto. And it actually stopped Rio Tinto's operations for, I think, 2 years, and I think they're just getting started again now. But again, we need to be careful because there's legitimate environmental concerns as well, right? And so, it's easy for somebody to say, oh, it's all disinformation or it's an influence operation. In this case, we have very good evidence, right? And that's why I've used this one. In the area of sustainability and renewables, we've seen a concerted, right? There's a lot of evidence that shows there's concerted efforts by fossil fuel interests and aligned political and economic interests to spread disinformation about climate change over the last 20 and 30 years. This has slowed the energy transition, and it's undermined sustainability goals and directly harmed sustainable businesses, right? And as well, we've seen that greenwashing by industry has also contributed to consumer skepticism, right? And people that just don't know what to believe, right? They're not sure what to believe because they've been exposed to falsehoods or manipulated information. So here in Australia, we've seen a recent example. This was, the idea that wind turbine kills whales. This is actually something this is misinformation that started in the UK and the United States. It spread over here, in this case around the Illawarra proposed wind farm. This idea that wind turbines kill whales. There's no evidence to suggest that's the case. In fact, there's very good evidence to suggest it's not the case. But nevertheless, it has stuck. And it's really, this is an interesting case because people that would normally be for renewables are being convinced that the renewables are now harming animals. And so they've got environmental concerns. It's hijacked environmental concerns, essentially, hijacked by these, malign actors essentially spreading this kind of disinformation. Another really good, this is a kind of an example. It's not quite greenwashing, but it's the use of deception and disinformation, in this case, embodied in software. So it was the Volkswagen software that was used to cheat emissions tests in the United States. And it affected 11 million cars worldwide, right? When it was caught out, it cost 30 billion in fines to Volkswagen. And again, led to a lot of, basic consumer skepticism about the kind of environmental claims that companies make, even companies that are making legitimate ones, right? So this kind of thing impacts across the board. It reduces trust and spreads doubt about a company's claim or anyone's. Again, we're probably, many of us have seen examples of financial or banking industry mis or disinformation. So one of these cases, now this wasn't all misinformation or disinformation, but the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. Now some of this was spread by rumors on Twitter that were at least exaggerated, right? And the speed at which this spread surprised a lot of people. This was the second largest bank failure in the United States. And it took 2 days to unfold, right? The largest one before that had taken 8 months to unfold, right? So we can see the sort of speed at which information, true or not, right, the way that it can spread on social media can happen so quickly that it can just overwhelm the kind of defenses that might actually be put up to try to mitigate the impact of it. Really recent one that I found. So I'm involved in a project at the moment. We've got we're crowdsourcing, monitoring the Australian federal elections for misinformation and disinformation that have anything to do with the elections. In this case, it doesn't have to do with the elections, but it has to do with Penny Wong. She's a prominent political figure here in Australia, of course. And so this was on Facebook. This was a paid ad. I saw this paid ad. It purported to be from 9 News. It looked dodgy to me, so I clicked on it, and it took me to a very dodgy website. But the webpage was actually quite well done. And in fact, it was purporting to be the transcript along with photos of Penny Wong in a studio with a person interviewing her. And it was basically just one long scam to get people to invest in some sort of Bitcoin thing. And Penny Wong is quoted on the site as saying, "I made a bunch of money, you should be doing it too," etc., kind of thing, right? So again, this is a kind of thing that erodes trust, right? And at best, right, it erodes trust, right? At worst, it tricks people out of their money, right? This clearly a scam operation. So some examples from some other sectors really quite quickly. This is a case example of Boeing. So we could consider this a defense company, but it's also, of course, commercial airlines. There's an outright conspiracy that's been going on for some time now, claiming that Boeing has had some real problems, right, with its various airplanes and accidents, et cetera. claiming that those are all the result of DEI policies, right? On the face of it, this is really hard to disprove, right? But on the face of it, it's kind of laughable, right? Like you go, well, look, quality control of parts, et cetera, and your construction habits, I don't think are the result of DEI things. On the other hand, proving that's the case can be quite difficult, and that's one of those problems where you can say, well, with a large degree of certainty, this is false. But you can't always be completely sure. And that's often the case with disinformation. We have to say, look, we're 90% sure, 99 in this case, I'd say. But yeah. Another example is COVID-19 life insurance myth, hoax. A lot of life insurance companies, both here in Australia and the United States, were forced to make statements saying that if you got the vaccine, you would still qualify for your life insurance. The disinformation or misinformation that was being spread was essentially that if you got vaccinated, you would no longer qualify for your life insurance because it was an experimental treatment, right? So this is, essentially it's taking companies' valuable time. It's also scaremongering, but it's taking companies' valuable time to try to respond to this kind of disinformation that's going around. And it's spreading distrust in the insurance industry, right? People are not trusting it because they think, oh, they're going to take advantage of me in some way. And distrust in public health measures as well, right? So again, overlapping areas. Another good example from COVID-19 was the kind of stuff around the 5G towers that, COVID-19 wasn't being spread by a virus, it was being spread by 5G towers. We may laugh at this, but I think over 50 cell phone towers in Europe were burned, right, or sabotaged as a result of this. Construction workers were threatened, right? Police had to be called in to protect construction workers at construction sites. So this can have this kind of misinformation, which many of us might kind of laugh at first, can really have a big impact on things like infrastructure.
Morgan,
Another
may I
example.
just ask
Oh,
a
yeah.
question on behalf of, and I've got to say the questions are coming in. They are exceptional quality questions.
Yep.
Some of them quite technical. So I think some of them you might address in the next part of this section. So I'm going to leave them for a moment.
Okay.
We might have to get some later. But someone has just asked, based on your experience, do you believe populations are more or less susceptible to misinformation, disinformation today? I mean, you're sort of, it feels like you're living in this world, and even some of the acronyms, and you sort of go to dodgy sites, and I think, I would just love to know, what's a dodgy site look like? Or, how can I start to get a little better at recognizing this? But do you think we are more susceptible to misinformation and disinformation today?
That's a really difficult question to answer. I would say it feels like it. But I'm not sure that it's actually the case. I think it's a little bit of a kind of an arms race sometimes between the sort of the cognitive defense that we put up and the social defense mechanisms that we put up against this, and the fact that technology and technological means of spreading disinformation are changing quite rapidly. So I think we're probably just as susceptible to disinformation as people were in the past. There's been very good examples of historical disinformation that was not spread digitally, but the information environment, I think, has made it easier to spread. And certainly things like amplification through bots and AI is making it much easier to spread. Now, I suspect this, again, is a bit of an arms race, right? As we get better cognitive defenses, we teach children and older adults and everyone to be more aware of these kinds of things. And we put up, policies in place and defense mechanisms. But yeah, that's a hard one.
Thank you.
Excuse me. So another example was the 15-minute cities. So this is sort of sustainability, but it's also project planning and infrastructure. This was the idea that 15-minute cities were actually about creating, sort of ghettos, making people get rid of their cars. One of the goals is obviously to make people less dependent on cars, but not to get rid of them. And it certainly wasn't about locking people into their neighborhoods, right? Which this became sort of a big conspiracy theory that this idea of 15-minute cities was basically just a way of trying to lock people into ghettos. And people are taking this really seriously, right? And projects are stopped, et cetera. And again, you kind of laugh at it, or I kind of laugh at it, but it's, this is, people really, really serious about this stuff. So I'm just going to begin sort of wrapping up, and then we can take some questions. Cross-sector insights and trends that we're seeing, right? Now this is, I think fairly obvious, right? The global village that we live in is really susceptible to digital wildfires, right? The new information environment and easy methods of amplification and bullhorning, using a bullhorn by, using bots to amplify messages, makes it really susceptible to these kind of digital wildfires, and they can be hard to put out. Human perceptions, emotions, attitudes, and behaviors are the primary target of disinformation and malign influence, but it's cyber-enabled, right? So where in the past, it might be by word of mouth or by spread through newspapers, and might take much longer for something to go viral, right? In the case of the AIDS stories, I think it took, something like 3 years for it to kind of achieve virality or breakout, right? Much more rapid, right? It might be a couple days now. We're seeing in a number of sectors, state actors are actively using disinformation, misinformation, and malign influence to target strategic industries. This includes mining, the energy sector, defense technology, but also banking in some cases, right? So organized crime that's associated with nation states like North Korea, for example. Disinformation as a service means malign actors can easily target anyone and any organization, right? The facility with which you can go out and hire groups of people to spread a message, create messages, and spread it, and target organizations or people is really quite scary. And AI tools are definitely making this worse, right? But again, this is a little bit of an arms race, right? We're also looking at AI tools to help in the detection and mitigation of mis and disinformation. So again, this kind of thing of, yeah, it makes it worse, but at the same time, it may also make it easier to sort of detect and stop some of these kinds of operations as they're happening. The other thing that we really reiterate is that there are definitely geopolitical dimensions here. So I mentioned in the last slide that state-sponsored economic warfare and espionage are definitely part of this. It's not all of it. Again, targeting supply chains, critical resources, et cetera. So this is something that we're increasingly seeing, and I just wanted to reiterate. So a couple key takeaways, right? It's pretty clear disinformation is a critical business risk, right? It's not just about politics. I think a lot of us sort of tend to think about disinformation in a political perspective, right? Because it's part of the zeitgeist today and a part what we're seeing around the world, but it is definitely a business risk. As far as I can tell, every sector is vulnerable in some way to some form of misinformation, and preparation, vigilance. And credibility, I should have put trust here. Having a trust bucket that is filled up in the first instance makes it much easier to try to respond to these things, right? If trust is low with consumers or customers or partners, it's much harder to fill it up, right? And it's much easier for malign actors to take advantage of that low trust, right? And we're seeing that. We see that politically, but we're also seeing that in the business world. I had a double slide there. I'm sorry, I should have taken one of those out. Yeah. And the effects can include financial losses, operational disruption, erosion of trust. We see reputational damage and reputational crisis, brand damage. In some cases, we've seen physical threats and harm, right? So like the 5G infrastructure. Definitely seen regulatory and policy impacts that can change the policy and economic environment in which a business acts. So that's the way that sometimes political and economic and business disinformation and misinformation can overlap. Yeah, and again, just to reiterate that it's a critical risk, I think. Now, in terms of defending against DMMI, and one of the reasons we're doing this talk is that I also give workshops on this, and this is something that I go into in much more detail in workshops, is defending against DMMI. I like to divide the ways that we can defend against and build resilience to disinformation, misinformation, and malign influence into sort of two ways. There's proactive efforts and there's reactive efforts. both of them are important, right? So with reactive efforts, we see things like debunking. So we've seen disinformation and we are debunking it actively. We see sort of developing counter narratives as part of strategic communications. Of course, there's incident response and crisis communications. And increasingly, we're seeing with incidences and crises, it may not be that disinformation started the incident or the crises, but disinformation then follows, right, very rapidly. And so part of incident response and crisis communication needs to take into account mis and disinformation and rumors that can spread really fast. And there's legal responses. Now, proactive efforts can include inoculation. So this is preparing people for the fact that disinformation is out there. They may not have seen it, but preparing them that there is disinformation out there. Training, I think training people in organizations to recognize the ways that they may be manipulated by information is important. Simulations and red teaming, this is something that's really common in cybersecurity, but really not very, as far as I can tell, very active in terms of how do we try to imagine ways that we might be targeted by mis or disinformation, and how do we respond to that? So these kind of red teaming or simulation efforts, I think, are probably really important. Network building, right? So this is developing relationships with, for example, platforms, right? Knowing who, if there's disinformation being spread on a platform and is violating TOCs in some way, who do we talk to at the platform, right? Have we developed relationships with the media, for example, as well, to try to call out, to try to use our media connections to call out and bring sunlight to the fact that there's disinformation going on in a particular area that's impacting one's business. Strategic communications, of course, really important. I talked about trust building, just really important, right? This idea that we need to sort of fill the trust bucket up in advance. And resilience building just more generally, right, through all of these means, trying to build resilience and preparation to be prepared for disinformation and malign influence attacks.
Morgan, may I just add here a comment by Ken, who said,
yes,
the claim that high trust helps defend against DMMI is somewhat counterintuitive. Isn't a healthy skepticism a more useful attitude? It's a great philosophical.
No, of course, yeah. Healthy skepticism, of course, is important. It's a funny thing, though, because skepticism is also weaponized by spreaders of disinformation, right? That whole thing of question everything, right? So when I'm talking about trust, for example, I'm not trying to convince people to be naive trusters, but in your business, if your relationship with your clients and your partners has been one of transparency, right, where you're open about problems and communicating things, that's what I'm talking about, trust, right? That kind of trust where they are then much more likely to see a communication about disinformation, et cetera, and see it and react to it in a positive way and say, okay, I've had a relationship with these people in this business. I trust the communications that they are putting out here. They have a track record of trustworthy communications, so I believe them, right? And where I'm going to take this into account. That was more what I'm talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. That's a great clarification. There's a number of questions from people in the chat about defending against DMMI. I wonder, are you going to talk about debunking or pre-bunking?
Oh, sorry, that it was Aubrey, but the question is me. Am I going to talk about pre-bunking and debunking? Not in any great detail in today's talk, of course, because we don't have that much time. It's a very, very interesting topic. I would suggest that anyone who's interested in it have a look at the debunking handbook that's put out. It has the latest research, it is evidence-based on the most recent research by experts in the field. It is quite good. In general, right, one of the things that, one of the main findings with talking about both, inoculating people against disinformation and debunking stuff are using techniques like the truth sandwich, right, where you proceed with, you start with a fact, right, or what we think the fact is. You give a warning about the fact that there's disinformation out there, and you explain why it's wrong, and then you reiterate with the fact, right? So this is a basic communication technique, sometimes called the truth sandwich, and there's a lot of research that suggests that this works. there was a lot of fear for a while that talking about disinformation might just be reinforcing it, right? This is the so-called blowback effect. There's been a whole lot of experimental data run by a bunch of people in Cambridge and some other institutions in Europe. Large-scale experimental data suggests that it's really not much of a problem. It's not that the blowback doesn't ever happen, it can, but that it's not a significant factor, and that we're much safer using stuff like the actually debunking, right, where we use the truth sandwich. You start with the fact, you warn that there's a problem. You may have heard, right, that you should drink, eat borax, right? That's actually something that was being said, right? It'll treat erectile dysfunction and arthritis and all this stuff, right? Sound too good to be true? Yeah, it is too good to be true, right? People are confusing boron and borax. If you want to get boron, you should be eating fruits and nuts. It is in borax, but borax is a cleaning product and it's not safe to eat, right? It can actually lead to harm. You want boron, eat your fruits and nuts, right? Taking borax is not going to solve arthritis, right? Or erectile dysfunction, or any of these other things that it's being claimed by influencers, right? I laugh because it's a funny example, right? But people that know better fall for that stuff.
Morgan, there is a question too that, and I know we're rapidly running out of time, so it may be our last question if that's okay, but a question that Raj has asked that's come up in a couple of different ways.
Sure.
If at an enterprise level, how do you account for this in the same way in your risk framework, for example, in the same way that you might account for, say, your cybersecurity risk? Is there a way that at a business level you can sensibly include this in your risk profile and manage it?
Look, I think yes, but I'm going to be upfront and frank. I am not a risk analysis expert. So I cannot give advice on how a business should be putting together their risk assessment formats. I work with people that are risk assessment experts, and this is a question that I'm very interested in. My gut is that yes, we can include it and we should include it in risk assessments. And when we look at things like scenarios and the kinds of scenarios that we might run up against, a business might run up against that has negative impacts on them, I think we should be looking at some of the scenarios that are either instigated by disinformation or are scenarios that start otherwise, right, a construction collapse or something like this, but then we'll rapidly have dis and misinformation and how that gets treated in the incident. But again, I would be outside of my expertise level to give advice on risk assessment. Yeah, sorry.
Look, thank you. Don't worry. I think I know what every one of us is going to be talking about when we get home tonight at every dinner party across the place where everyone's listened to you today, Morgan. And look, thanks everyone so much for your questions today. And thank you, Morgan, for sharing disinformation in a way that is really accessible and in a way that matters to business leaders. And thinking about how it can really, disrupt operations, manipulate markets, and damage reputation. If anyone on this class wants to hear more about this fascinating topic, we offer a 1 or 2 day program that can be offered within your organisation. So it's more like, in effect, a closed cohort program and a sense of consulting, in a sense, for your organisation. And we'll send you information about how to access that, as well as potentially, I will send you the last remaining questions that we have in our Q&A, Morgan, and you might be able to respond to those as well. And we'll provide details about the link to this session as well. And also, I'm really excited to announce that our next session in this 5-program masterclass series with the Hunt Lab is with Dr. Ariel Kruger, and he will cover strategic writing for clarity and influence. And that session will be on the 28th of March. So we really do hope to see you there. Thank you for your attendance today. Have a great weekend. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Katrina. Really a pleasure.
Morgan.